Susie Rabbit and her edible doll adventure. One crisp afternoon, Patty Rabbit sat with a book in her lap, staring at its pictures, but with a frown on her face. The beautiful day around her didn't lift her spirits, and she didn't even notice her dear grandmother Rabbit slowly coming down the path. "Why, Patty, my dear," Grandmother Rabbit said, her soft voice full of concern, "you look as if something is troubling you. What's the matter, child?" "Oh, Grandmother," Patty exclaimed, finally noticing her. She dropped her book and hurried over to give her grandmother a hug. "I didn't see you coming. I'm so glad you're here. Tell me what's wrong, sweetheart. Don't you like your book?" Patty sighed deeply and looked down at the book she had tossed aside.
"Well,
I do like it sometimes. But, Grandmother, it's always about Peter Rabbit and Jackie Rabbit and Benny Rabbit. It's always about the boy rabbits doing fun and brave things. But don't little girl rabbits ever have any exciting stories? I want to read about them too." Grandmother Rabbit chuckled softly and sat down on the wooden steps in front of Patty's house. She opened her knitting bag, pulling out soft, pastel-colored yarn, and began knitting as she spoke. "Of course, little girl rabbits have their stories. Why, I can tell you one right now. Have you ever heard about Susie Rabbit and her very special doll?" Patty's eyes lit up with excitement, her ears perking straight up. "No, Grandmother. Tell me, please. What happened to Susie Rabbit?" "Well then," Grandmother Rabbit began, her voice full of warmth and mischief, "let me tell you all about Susie Rabbit. Once upon a time, in a meadow far from here, there lived a little rabbit named Susie. Now, Susie wasn't as lucky as some rabbits. Her family didn't have all the comforts that you do. They lived in a cozy but humble burrow, and food was often scarce. While other little rabbits had toys and stories, Susie didn't have much to play with, and sometimes she didn't even have enough to eat. One bright, sunny day, Susie was out playing when she saw something wonderful. A little girl passed through the woods with a beautiful doll in her arms. The doll had a frilly dress and shiny eyes that twinkled in the sunlight. Susie's heart filled with longing. She ran home, her tiny paws barely touching the ground, and burst through the door of her burrow. "Mother! Mother!" Susie cried. "I want a doll. Please, can I have one?" But her mother sighed and shook her head. "Oh, Susie dear, we live far away from any stores, and even if we could get to one, we have no money to buy a doll. I'm sorry, sweetheart." Poor Susie was heartbroken. She cried and cried, wishing with all her might for a doll of her own. Her father returned home that evening to find her still sniffling. "What's the matter with our little Susie?" he asked gently as he sat down beside her. "She wants a doll," her mother explained softly, "but we can't give her one." That night, after Susie had gone to bed, her mother had an idea. "We may not be able to buy a doll," she whispered to Susie's father, "but we can make her one." "Make a doll?" her father asked, surprised. "How could we possibly do that?" "I have a plan," her mother said with a twinkle in her eye. "Go over to the farm and bring me a large carrot and a crisp head of lettuce." Without hesitation, Susie's father hopped over the hill to the nearby farm and returned with a carrot and lettuce, curious to see what his wife had in mind. Susie's mother got to work right away. She cut the top of the carrot to make a head, using berries for the eyes, mouth, and nose. Then, she fashioned a beautiful dress from the lettuce leaves, creating a ruffled skirt. She even made a tiny cape and bonnet from the lettuce and fastened everything together with little sticks her husband had whittled from twigs. When she was done, she smiled and held the doll up for her husband to see. "There, what do you think?" "It looks nice enough to eat," he said, rubbing his paws together and licking his lips. But Susie's mother sprinkled the doll with water to keep it fresh and placed it beside Susie's bed. When the sun peeked through the window the next morning, Susie opened her eyes and gasped in delight.
"Oh, a doll."
"I have a doll." She jumped out of bed and hugged the doll tightly, her heart bursting with happiness. For the rest of the day, Susie played with her doll, naming it Letty after its leafy dress. But as the day wore on, something happened. You see, Susie didn't have treats and snacks like you do, Patty. And after playing with Letty for a while, the delicious smell of fresh carrot and lettuce became too tempting to resist. At first, Susie thought, I'll just nibble a tiny bit of a cape. Letty won't mind. So, she nibbled at the lettuce cape, leaving the ruffled skirt untouched. But soon, one nibble turned into two, and before she knew it, the entire cape was gone. Well, Susie reasoned, Letty can still look beautiful with just her dress. But by lunchtime, Susie couldn't stop herself. She nibbled one of the ruffles off the skirt. It's still pretty, she thought, munching away. By the afternoon, the bonnet was gone, and by dinner time, poor Letty was just a lonely carrot with no dress at all. Finally, Susie gave in. A doll without a dress isn't much use anyway, she said, and with a small smile, she ate the entire carrot. And that was the end of Susie Rabbit's doll. When Grandmother Rabbit finished her story, Patty was giggling so much that she could barely sit still. "Oh, Grandmother," she laughed. "That was such a fun story. I think Susie's doll was very special, even if she did eat it. Can we have this story printed in a book? I know other little girl rabbits would love to hear about Susie Rabbit just as much as they love hearing about Peter and Jackie Rabbit." Grandmother Rabbit smiled warmly at Patty. "Well, perhaps we can," she said, patting Patty on the head. "But for now, let's keep this story just between us." And that is how the story of Susie Rabbit came to be told. One day, it might even be printed in a book for all little rabbits to enjoy.